Something just happened in American politics that should be impossible. Congress disappeared for more than 2 weeks in the middle of a national and international crisis, and instead of urgent hearings, war powers debate, or real oversight, the Speaker of the House was out doing partisan campaign theater. Let that sink in. Not emergency oversight, not accountability, not constitutional duty. Campaign stunts. And here is the number that changes everything. 2 weeks. 2 weeks with the House adjourned. 2 weeks while questions mounted over U.S. involvement abroad. 2 weeks while lawmakers avoided direct confrontation over executive war powers. 2 weeks while the public got noise instead of answers. Read that again. 2 weeks. In a functioning system, that number would trigger wall-to-wall scrutiny. Instead, what we got was something else entirely. Footage of Speaker Mike Johnson in Virginia, rallying a tiny crowd, warning of Democratic investigations, throwing around the word Marxist, and pleading for political survival. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand why this is bigger than one speech, bigger than one state, and bigger than one nervous party leader. You are going to understand why this moment reveals what the modern House majority is actually prioritizing when the stakes are highest. And if you care about the difference between governing and campaigning, this story matters. Let's get into it. To understand why this matters so much, you first need to understand the backdrop. The House stood adjourned until 2:30 p.m. on Monday, April 13, 2026. That is not a small procedural detail. That is the central fact. Because during that stretch, the United States was facing major questions over military escalation, foreign policy failure, and the limits of presidential power. Critics were asking basic constitutional questions. Where was Congress? Where were the hearings? Where was the war powers debate? Where was the institutional response that Article 1 is supposed to guarantee? Because Congress is not decorative. Congress is not supposed to function as a social media reaction squad that clocks in only when it is politically convenient. It is supposed to deliberate, investigate, authorize, constrain, and oversee, especially on matters of war and executive power. That is the job. And yet, while that responsibility was sitting there, untouched, footage emerged showing Mike Johnson campaigning in Virginia over congressional maps. That is the contrast. That is the story. Not one or two offhand comments. Not one fundraiser tucked quietly into the calendar. A full political message built around grievance, fear, and electoral panic. And this is where the story becomes more revealing than the headlines. Because Johnson was not just making an argument about district maps. He was telling you exactly what his side fears most: losing control of the House, facing investigations, and being forced to answer questions they do not want to answer. That was the message. Not governance, survival. Now let's talk about the Virginia event itself, because this is where the mask slips. The answer did not come from a committee hearing. It did not come from a press conference about war powers. It came from a campaign-style event in Virginia. And here is why that changes everything. According to the footage, Johnson appeared alongside former Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin and other Republicans as part of a push against new congressional maps. The argument from Republicans was that Democrats were engaged in unfair gerrymandering and that voters needed to reject it. That was the frame. But the deeper political subtext was obvious. The House majority is razor thin. Republicans know it, and their national strategy depends on preserving every possible seat. Johnson more or less said so himself. He emphasized just how tiny the Republican margin is. He warned that if Democrats take the House, they will investigate Trump, turn committees into oversight bodies, and move aggressively in ways Republicans find threatening. Think about what that means. The Speaker of the House, during a period when critics say Congress should be exercising oversight, is on stage begging voters to stop the other party from doing oversight later. That is not subtle. That is an admission. It is the political version of telling on yourself. And then came the message that has become standard in MAGA rhetoric. Everything is woke. Everything is crazy. Democrats are Marxists. And the only thing standing between America and chaos is continued Republican control. We have heard this script before, but here it lands differently because of the timing. Timing is everything in politics, and when your institution is absent during a constitutional moment, your off-site rhetoric becomes far more revealing than it otherwise would be. Johnson warning that Democrats would impeach Trump, investigate him, and revive a woke agenda if they win the House. Now, there is another layer here that deserves attention. Johnson's framing on gerrymandering is politically convenient, but critics immediately pointed out the obvious contradiction. Because Republicans have hardly positioned themselves as principled opponents of gerrymandering in general. In fact, Democrats have repeatedly supported broader anti-gerrymandering reforms that Republicans opposed, and the wider national fight over maps did not emerge in a vacuum. It came after aggressive power plays in states like Texas, prompting counter-moves elsewhere. That context matters, because once you understand that, Johnson's Virginia message stops sounding like a constitutional sermon and starts sounding like what it is, a partisan scramble over electoral advantage. And that would be one thing if Congress were simultaneously doing its job back in Washington. But that is precisely the problem. It wasn't. So the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. While major questions about war, executive authority, and oversight were hanging in the air, the Speaker was out saying, in essence, "Please help us keep the House so we can stop investigations." That is the message underneath all the applause lines. That is the real headline. Johnson saying Republicans have one of the smallest margins in U.S. history, and calling on Virginia voters to protect the House majority. And then, of course, he escalated further. He attacked Democrat Abigail Spanberger by saying she talks like a moderate and governs like a Marxist. He described the Democratic Party in sweeping ideological terms. He cast the election as common sense versus crazy. This is where rhetoric becomes a substitute for responsibility. Because notice what happens in this kind of speech. The more specific the governing failure, the more abstract the counterattack becomes. Questions about war powers? Answer, Marxists. Questions about oversight? Answer, crazy. Questions about constitutional duty? Answer, woke agenda. This is not accidental. It is strategic. When you cannot defend the substance, you flood the zone with culture war language. That is the mechanism. And it works, politically, because it transforms accountability into identity warfare. It tells supporters not to evaluate conduct, but to fear the alternative. That is why these speeches matter. Not because the content is new, it is not, but because the context exposes what the content is doing. It is cover. Now let's zoom out, because this story is not just about Johnson. It is about the broader behavior of a Congress that, according to critics, is refusing to act like a co-equal branch. And one of the most telling moments came not from Johnson, but from Republican Congressman Mike Turner. Turner sits on the Oversight and Armed Services Committees. That matters. Those are not symbolic assignments. Those are central roles in matters of war, defense, and executive accountability. So when he was asked basic questions on national television about what was happening, questions the public would reasonably expect Congress to understand, his answers were astonishingly thin. At one point, when pressed about developments involving the Strait of Hormuz and what the administration knew, Turner essentially said the host would have to ask the president. Read that again. A member of Congress on Oversight and Armed Services saying, effectively, ask the president. That is the opposite of oversight. Oversight is not repeating the executive branch line. Oversight is not shrugging in public. Oversight is not acting like a spectator. Oversight means Congress gets the answers so the public can get the truth. And when lawmakers in those positions cannot or will not articulate basic facts, it reveals something deeper than a bad interview. It reveals institutional atrophy, or worse, institutional surrender. Turner deflecting questions and saying the president just tweeted it, so the host would have to ask the president. And then came another telling exchange. Turner referred to the conflict as ongoing, but when challenged with the president's own claims that the war was effectively won, Turner could not provide clarity. Again, the message was confusion layered over deference. This matters because democracies do not function on vibes and tweets. They function on process, authority, and accountability, or at least they are supposed to. If the executive branch is making sweeping claims, Congress should be testing them, verifying them, and forcing coherence. Not echoing contradictions, not hiding behind ambiguity, not waiting for social media posts to define reality. And that brings us to another front in this same pattern: the Epstein Files controversy and the refusal to apply consistent standards. Congressman Byron Donalds, another Republican member of the Oversight Committee, was asked whether former Attorney General Pam Bondi should testify after being subpoenaed. His answer was, essentially, not really, or at least not necessarily. And that immediately exposed the double standard. Because Republicans have not been shy about demanding testimony, contempt proceedings, and aggressive compliance when the target is a political opponent. But when the pressure turns inward, suddenly the standards get softer, the urgency fades, and everything becomes procedural. We have seen this movie before. One standard for enemies, another standard for allies. And when Donalds was pressed on why former officials like Hillary Clinton could be dragged into testimony while Bondi might be excused, the answer was vague, conditional, evasive. We'll see. That phrase tells you a lot. In politics, "we'll see" usually means the principle is not the principle. The principle is the person. And once again, that is the larger story. Not just hypocrisy, though there is plenty of that. Institutional selectivity. Rules that only exist when useful. Oversight as a weapon, not a duty. Byron Donalds saying he does not really think Bondi needs to testify at this point. Now, consider the consequence cascade here. The immediate consequence is obvious. Public trust erodes. If Congress disappears during a crisis, if the Speaker spends that time on campaign warfare, if key committee members deflect basic questions, and if subpoena standards shift depending on partisan convenience, the public sees the pattern. But zoom out. The regional consequence is that state-level fights, like the battle over Virginia maps, become proxies for national institutional control. That means local elections are no longer just local. They become pressure points in a national struggle over whether the House will investigate, restrain, or protect a president. And here is what has not received enough attention: the global consequence. When Congress appears weak, absent, or partisan at the precise moment the world is watching U.S. power, allies and adversaries notice. They notice whether America's legislative branch is functioning. They notice whether war powers are debated or ignored. They notice whether oversight is real or performative. That is not a domestic-only story. That affects deterrence, credibility, and stability. Because the message sent abroad is simple: the executive may be acting, but the legislature is missing. And that has consequences far beyond Washington. This is the villain's trap in political form. Republicans spent years denouncing overreach, demanding accountability, and presenting themselves as guardians of constitutional order. But in protecting one leader, they risk creating the exact thing they once claimed to fear: an increasingly unchecked executive paired with a compliant legislature. They thought they were preserving power. What they may be creating instead is irrelevance. Now, there are things we have to be honest about, because this story is serious but not without complications. First, partisan rhetoric around redistricting exists on both sides. Neither party has clean hands in the broader history of map fights. Anyone pretending otherwise is selling something. Second, congressional recesses and adjournments are not unusual in themselves. The issue is not that the House ever adjourns. The issue is what was happening during this adjournment, what was not happening, and what leading figures chose to prioritize instead. Third, public clips do not always capture every closed-door action lawmakers may be taking. There may have been briefings, there may have been conversations out of public view. That is fair to acknowledge. But here is why those limitations do not undermine the core point. In moments of real crisis, leadership is not judged only by what happens privately. It is judged by visible priorities, by public urgency, by whether the institution projects seriousness. And in this case, the public-facing picture was damning. The Speaker was not leading a visible oversight push. He was delivering campaign lines in Virginia. Committee Republicans were not projecting command of the facts. They were evading them on television. And allies of the administration were not insisting on uniform accountability. They were softening it when it became inconvenient. That pattern is the story. There is one more contrast here that matters, and it came from Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. Whatever you think of his politics, his speech hit on something far more grounded than the abstractions and insults coming from Johnson's event. He spoke in practical terms about costs, healthcare, utilities, housing, insurance, war spending, and the burden on ordinary people. That matters. Because voters do not live inside cable news slogans. They live inside bills, premiums, rent, gas prices, childcare costs, and fear about the future. And that is where political messaging becomes real. Johnson's side is trying to frame the stakes as common sense versus crazy. But Ossoff's framing is more concrete. Who is paying more? Who is getting squeezed? And who is benefiting? That is a fundamentally different kind of political language. One speaks in enemies, the other speaks in consequences. One says, fear them. The other says, look at your life. And in modern politics, that difference is enormous. Because when a party cannot defend institutional behavior, it often retreats into theatrical conflict. But when another party can tie politics back to material conditions, it has a chance to cut through the noise. That is why speeches like Ossoff's resonate, not because they are magically above politics, but because they reconnect politics to lived reality. So let's bring this all the way back. Mike Johnson wanted this moment to be about maps in Virginia. Instead, it became a window into the governing priorities of the House majority. He wanted to warn voters that Democrats would investigate Trump. Instead, he reminded everyone that Republicans appeared deeply afraid of investigation. He wanted to cast Democrats as radicals. Instead, he highlighted how thin the governing bench looks when real questions are asked. He wanted a campaign event. What he got was an exposure. That is the irony at the center of this story. The party that claims to stand for order keeps turning moments of constitutional stress into messaging opportunities. The institution that is supposed to check power looks increasingly organized around protecting it. And the speaker, rather than lowering the temperature through seriousness, chose to raise it through spectacle. That is not strength. That is insecurity with a microphone. And every time this happens, the public learns something important. When pressure rises, priorities become visible. This time, the priority did not look like oversight. It did not look like constitutional duty. It did not even look like confidence. It looked like fear. Fear of losing the House. Fear of investigations. Fear of exposure. Fear that once the committees actually function, a different story starts getting told. As of now, here is where things stand. The House had remained adjourned for an extended period during intense public scrutiny. Mike Johnson used that period, at least in part, for partisan campaigning in Virginia. Key Republican committee members struggled or declined to provide clear answers on issues they are supposed to oversee. And internal allies appeared reluctant to enforce the same accountability standards they demand from others. That is not a healthy pattern. The real question now is what happens next. Does Congress reassert itself as a co-equal branch? Or does it continue drifting into a posture where campaigning replaces governing and loyalty replaces oversight? That is the fork in the road. If this breakdown gave you a clearer view of what is really happening beneath the headlines, share it with someone who still thinks this is just normal political theater. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive into where power is moving, who is dodging accountability, and what the political class hopes you won't notice. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Is this incompetence, or is it intentional? See you in the next one.